In this video, I'm going to show you 5 great ways that you can study by yourself for free and improve your IELTS speaking score by at least 1 band. So, let's get started. So in this video, we're going to talk about the 5 specific steps that you can take to study by yourself and improve your IELTS speaking score. We're going to do that in a little bit. First, I just want to give you some quick general tips for studying anything by yourself. Now this could be like studying a language, studying like computer programming, it could be like how to eat healthier, whatever you have to do by yourself. These are some great steps that you can follow. The first is to find a study buddy, so someone that you can study with. And the first reason that that's very good is because they will give you accountability. They are an accountability partner. So if you're feeling lazy, they're going to tell you, hey, come on, let's study. And you can do the same for them when they're feeling lazy. And for learning a language, they're also really good for giving you a chance to talk, to improve your fluency, some speaking practice, but also they might be able to hear the problems that you have and give you some free feedback. So there's many reasons why studying with someone, with your study buddy, is a good idea. The next thing is to make a specific plan. Now we say in English, failing to plan is planning to fail. So you definitely need to have some kind of plan. I suggest using a scheduling tool like Google Calendar or there's many other calendar tools. And you plan out each day and each specific time what you're going to be doing. And this, again, could be for learning a language, or it might be the days that you go to the gym and what you'll do at the gym on that day. But you have to be very specific. Don't just say, study English, because then you sit down and, what do you actually do? Be much more specific. Say, take IELTS listening test number 3, questions 1 to 30. And then you sit down and you know exactly what to do, and it's much easier then just to do it. And it's important to be realistic when you're setting that. If you know that you've got your studies or you've got your job and you only have maybe 1 hour per day to work on IELTS or to go to the gym or whatever it is, don't schedule 5 hours. It's not realistic. You're just going to get disappointed. So make it a realistic target for each day. The third thing is to be consistent, to do something every day. So many people say about great athletes, like footballers and basketball players and so on, that the difference between those great athletes and kind of sort of okay athletes is that the great athletes show up every day. Even if they feel tired, even if they're, lazy or they have a little injury, they show up and they do something. So that's really important. And what I like to use is the 5 more minutes rule. So if you're studying and you've been going for maybe 30 minutes and you start to feel very lazy, just hold on, don't quit yet. Tell yourself, okay, I'll do 5 more minutes and then I'll quit. Because at the end of that 5 minutes, you might feel that you suddenly have more energy and you can keep going. So just delay that feeling of quitting for 5 minutes and see what happens. And my last general tip is if you're doing something where you're going to take an exam at the end, book your exam on your first day of studying. But don't book it for like the next day, because then obviously you won't have enough time. But try to book it for at some specific date in the future, because then you know what your deadline is. We always work better with a deadline, right? So make sure you book maybe your IELTS test, maybe it's your driving test, whatever it is. Book that test so that you know when you're going to do it. You have the clock counting down until the day that you take the test. And that will push you, it'll make you feel more motivated. So those are just some general tips about studying anything by yourself and how you can be motivated. Let's go back to IELTS speaking now. So the 5 specific steps that you can take to study by yourself and get a higher score. The first one is related to vocabulary. And what I want you to do for vocabulary is think about words that you know very well that have a simple meaning. Words like good and bad and hot and angry and scared and happy. Words like that. And I want you to take those words and learn high-level equivalents of those words. And we're going to look at some in a minute. Remember that native speakers, we often use quite extreme language. We don't say, oh, it's very cold today. We say it's freezing cold. We don't say, oh, that's good. We say, oh, that's amazing. We use extreme language. So this is a very quick way of taking those simple ideas and using high-level vocabulary to express those ideas. So let's quickly go through and learn some examples. Of course, there are many more, but these are some useful ones for you to get started. The first one, the idea of big, we could say massive, gigantic, huge, enormous. If something's small, we could say tiny, microscopic, minuscule. If something's hot, we can say it's boiling, it's scorching, or it's roasting. Then for cold, we have freezing and Arctic. Freezing, Arctic. If something's good, we've got loads and loads of words. Let me give you a few. We have amazing, terrific, fantastic, brilliant, marvelous, wonderful. When something's bad, we could say it's dreadful, terrible, wretched, or underwhelming. And if we're scared, we could say we're terrified or we are horrified. And let's see how that can help us to improve our vocabulary score. So you could say, the movie had a big budget, so I expected it to be good, but it turned out to be bad. Now, there's no grammar mistakes there, but the vocabulary is a little bit basic. So instead you could say, the movie had a massive budget, so I expected it to be amazing, but it turned out to be rather underwhelming. And you can see already we've just changed the three simple words of big, good, and bad. We've added some high-level vocabulary, and suddenly it's a much better sentence. Now the list I gave you is just a little taster. There's loads of these simple ideas with complicated words that we can find. What I suggest you do is, if you want to find your own, you just search for synonyms and then the word. So you might search for synonyms of big and just type that into Google or into Bing and it'll come up with a big list. But it's also important when you're studying by yourself to make sure that you're using the words in the right way, in the right situation, with the right feeling. So I suggest reading at least 5 example sentences for each of those words. And a really good website that I like, that I use with all my students, is called sentencedict.com. And it's a very simple website, but you search for a word and it gives you example sentences with that word. So you can read all the example sentences you want and you get a much better feeling of how to use that particular word. Second step that we're going to talk about is also about vocabulary, but this time we're talking about idioms. So idioms are, those short phrases that we use a lot in English. And there's so many of them, and some of them are very, very complicated. And what I don't want you to do is to learn lots of idioms that you could just never use in the test. They're such a complicated, specific idea, and it's really hard to find the opportunity to use them. Forget about those. Instead, I want you to learn a small group of idioms that are based on simple ideas, just like the vocabulary we looked at before. For example, ideas like something is easy, something is expensive, something is very fun to do, that kind of thing. And the reason we learn idioms that are based on those simple ideas is because those are much easier to find an opportunity to use in the real IELTS speaking test. You know, it's easy to find an opportunity to say something is expensive, or something was really fun, or something was very easy. We can find many opportunities like that, and each opportunity is a chance for you to drop in one of your idioms to show the examiner just how good your vocabulary is. Now, we have a whole video with a bunch of different idioms just like that, based on simple ideas. In this video, we're just going to look at one of them, and that is the word easy. So the idea of easy, we could say easy, we could say very, very, very easy, but we could use an idiom instead. We could say a piece of cake or a walk in the park. For example, in the sentence like this, I'd been worried that the exam would be really tough, but it turned out to be very easy. The sentence is okay, but let's see what happens when we add the idiom. I'd been worried that the exam would be really tough, but it turned out to be a piece of cake. Or, but it turned out to be a walk in the park. Again, we can see immediately we add that simple idiom, and it really takes the level of our sentence to the next level. Now, if you are preparing for the IELTS exam and you're studying by yourself, but you also feel like you want the help and guidance of maybe a course, well, we have just the course for you. We have our IELTS Complete Guide course. It covers the speaking, reading, writing, and listening, and it's updated every 4 months with the newly released IELTS speaking questions, and we put in answers to all of those questions as well. So it doesn't matter when you take the IELTS exam, you know that that course is going to be ready, it's going to be fresh, it's going to be waiting to help you along. If you're interested in that and you want to find out more details, the link is just down here. Step 3 is all about grammar improvement. So this is really important because if you're making a lot of mistakes in the IELTS speaking test, it's going to pull your score down. The examiner basically will sit and count how many mistakes you make. They could be huge mistakes or they could be tiny little mistakes, like you forgot to put the S at the end of a word or something like that. It doesn't matter big or small, all of the mistakes count. The more mistakes you make, the lower your grammar score is going to get. Now, a lot of students have a few specific mistakes that they make a lot. So it might be things like forgetting the past tense, or it might be not making the subject of the sentence agree with the verb, or it might be something else. The best way to find those mistakes that you often make is to have a class with a teacher. Now, I know I said that this video was all about studying by yourself, and we are going to talk about that in just a second. But if you would like to take an IELTS speaking mock test and find all of those grammar mistakes and kind of accelerate your improvement in grammar, you can send me a message. We have that service. Send me an email, francis@lastminuteenglish.org. So that's the quickest way to improve your grammar. But if you do want to study just by yourself, or it's just you and your study buddy studying together, then a very useful video is our video that you can find the link to just up here or maybe up here, which is our 10 most common IELTS grammar mistakes. What you can do is watch that video, find those mistakes, and then see if you can notice when you're saying your answer if you're making those mistakes. If you can find those mistakes in your own answers and correct them and keep improving, then that's obviously a great way and a cheaper way to be able to improve your grammar by yourself. Now let's take a look at one of those very common grammar mistakes. I think probably the most common grammar mistake, and that is forgetting to use the past tense. So any question that comes in IELTS where it has something like when you were a child or when you were younger, or even if it has past tense verbs in the question, like describe a piece of clothing you bought for someone. If it's anything like that, you know that you need to use the past tense for almost every verb in your answer. So let's do a quick exercise and let me show you just how important remembering the past tense is. So I'm going to answer a question that is about the past. And I want you to listen, just listen first of all, see if you can count how many different verbs I use in the past tense. So the question is, did you play sports when you were younger? And my answer, yes, I played a lot of sports during my childhood actually. I used to play football with my friends before school. We loved it so much that we would continue playing at lunchtime. I also joined a cricket team and sometimes competed in cross-country races. But I didn't like rugby. It was too rough for me, so I avoided it as much as possible. And I also steered clear of golf. It just wasn't my cup of tea. So that's my answer. How many past tense verbs did you hear? If you want, you can go back and listen again, see if you can count them. But the answer was 9. There were 9, just in that short answer, 9 different verbs that I used in the past tense. So what I want you to do now is take a look at the answer and see if you can identify those 9 different verbs. So just read through it by yourself, pause the video and find those 9 verbs in the past tense. And also see if you can identify the 2 ways that we talk about your habits in the past. Okay? So altogether there's 11 things to find. Pause, try and find them now. Okay, so let's take a look at where those 9 past tense verbs were. They were here, you can see them in green, and the 2 sort of words or verbs that we use for a past habit. Those are used to and would. Those are very, very useful if you've forgotten what the actual way to say the past tense of a verb is. So they're like a little cheat way. And we use those for habits that we had when we were younger. So remember when I said that the examiner is counting your mistakes? Imagine if you'd forgotten to use the past tense for that answer. The examiner would have counted 9 or maybe even 11 mistakes in just one answer. And that is pulling your score all the way down. So it's really important to focus on the past tense and to focus on those other common mistakes, the common grammar mistakes when you're studying by yourself, to make sure that at the very least you get rid of those mistakes. And that's really going to reduce the overall number of mistakes that you make, which is going to bring your grammar score back up. Step 4 is to work on common chunks to make your pronunciation and your fluency better. So, chunks. What are chunks? Chunks are when we take several words that often go together and we kind of say them in one blur. This is not a good way to explain it, but one blur. Like we say them almost like one long word, everything connected together. In English, we call that a chunk. And they're really important because native speakers use chunks, or chunking, we often call it, instead of using individual words. As native speakers, we don't think about just one word, one word, one word. We think about chunk. And they're really important for IELTS because they're one of the requirements for your pronunciation. So if you want to get a band 7 or 8 or 9, you have to be doing some chunking. You can't be talking like this because this means you will get a 6. So we don't want that. We have to squash some words together. Now there are hundreds, probably thousands of chunks in English, and it's not really possible to learn all of them. We do have another very useful video all about this, and you can find the link down here, or you can click up here And that video is all about some of the most common and most useful chunks so that you can kind of quickly start to learn them. But in this video, we're just going to look at 3. One for the past, one for the present, and one for the future. So the past is, when I was a kid, I would always... So let's break that down. So it's when I was a kid, I would always. So the d sort of jumps over to the always. I would always. When I was a kid, I would always, and then you say your habit in the past. For example, when I was a kid, I would always play football outside in the street. Or, when I was a kid, I would always play video games for hours after school. Or, when I was a kid, I would always struggle in history class. The next one is for the present, and it's when we're saying we like something very much. You can say, I'm a huge fan of... So, I'm a huge. The stress is on huge. We sort of make it go up in the intonation. I'm a huge. You can do that. I'm a huge fan of. And fan of becomes fan of. I'm a huge fan of. And then you say the thing that you like. For example, I'm a huge fan of Italian food. I'm a huge fan of classical music. I'm a huge fan of learning new languages. And then for the future, we can talk about a plan for the future and say, one thing so it's thing guide. One thing I'd like to do. One thing I'd like to do. So it's not to do, it's to do. To do. I'd like to do. One thing I'd like to do is, and the do and the is get kind of squashed together as well. They're connected by a W sound. Do is. One thing I'd like to do is. One thing I'd like to do is, and then you say your plan. For example, one thing I'd like to do is work for a startup company. Or one thing I'd like to do is visit Paris in the spring. Or one thing I'd like to do is live in a big house with a huge garden. And the key here with all of these chunks, these are just 3, but there are many, many more that you can learn. You can make your own. You can find them on different websites online. But the key is to keep practicing them. Practice saying and saying and saying until it doesn't sound like word, 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 word. It sounds like sentence. It sounds like chunk. It's not the stones crossing the river. It's the river. It flows. That's when you know that your pronunciation and your fluency is getting better. Step 5, the final step, is probably the most important step, and that is to preview the questions before you get to the IELTS speaking test. So there's nothing worse than spending your time in the test being asked questions that you haven't prepared for and trying to think of something to talk about. So, for example, if the question is, talk about someone you know who's moved to a new place recently, and you have to spend your 1 minute of preparation thinking, who did John move? No, he's in the same house. Sarah? No. So you're wasting your time. Instead, you should make sure that you know what your story is going to be for any question well before, like weeks and weeks before you go into the test. Don't spend your time in the test thinking of the story. In the test, you should be thinking about your vocabulary, your grammar, your pronunciation, and your fluency, not about what can I say here. So it's really important to preview all of the questions that could come. Now, remember that typically there'll be about 30 part 1 topics at any one time, and there'll be about 50 part 2 and part 3 topics. So don't wait until the day before your exam to start looking. I usually suggest at least 1 month in advance, because that way you should have enough time to think about good stories for everything so that, you feel a bit more prepared. And if you're not sure how to preview, like what should you do, let me give you a step-by-step guide to exactly what I think is the best way to preview each of the questions. Now, what you'll need to do this preparation is a notepad and a pen, or maybe your laptop to write on. You'll need a list of the questions, and you'll need your phone for recording and listening to an answer. So the first step, read the question and think what you can say. What is the story going to be that you're talking about? That's true for part 2, the long part, but also for part 1 and part 3. Make sure you have something to say. The next step is to time yourself using your phone. See how long it takes you to say your answer. For part 1 and part 3, the answers should be at least maybe 15-20 seconds. And at most, about 45 seconds. For part 2, your answer should be about 2 minutes. While you're answering the question for the first time, keep your pen and notepad, and when you get to any words that you don't know in English, write them down in your own language, put the paper aside, and then at the end of answering, check, and then look in a dictionary and find the way to say those words. So you're building your vocabulary. The next step is to answer the same question again, but this time try to bring in those new words, that new vocabulary. And then that second time, or maybe the third time, you're going to record yourself and then listen back to the recording. It's a bit weird, but you'll get used to it. And it's a really, really good way of truly understanding by yourself what your strengths are and what areas are weak. What are your weaknesses that you need to focus on? And when you've found those problems, maybe like there's a big pause at one point, work on the problem, try to solve it, and then repeat. So say the answer again and record it, listen again. Say it again and record it, listen again. And get it to the point where you feel you can't improve anymore. Now, all of that you should be doing, let's say, 2 weeks or 3 weeks before the test, maybe even more. And that's great. But the day before the test, what I want you to do is to revisit, come back and look at all of the questions again and just go through each answer one more time, because then it'll be nice and fresh in your brain. Now, one more thing that I want to give you is a little checklist that you can use to listen and try to mark yourself when you're listening to those recordings. I know that this is like a list inside a list inside a list. It's like a Russian doll. It's like we're sort of, it's like we're in the movie Inception, which is a pretty good movie. If you haven't seen that movie, you should watch it. But let me give you the third list. So this is a list of the mistakes that you should be listening for, that the examiner will listen for, and that you can find and correct by yourself. The first thing is the length of your answer. So if it's part 2, did you speak for 2 minutes? If it's part 1, like we said, maybe 15-20 seconds to about 40-45 seconds. And the same for part 3. The second part is pronunciation. Are there any words that you hear that you said incorrectly, or you're not confident when you say that word? And then you find those ones, you practice, get more confident. Then listen for your fluency. Are there any parts with a big pause? Are there some words or some ideas that you can't remember, or you find it hard to kind of organize your thoughts? And if there are, focus on those and either get them right or change them. Make sure that there are no big pauses in your answer. The fourth part is coherence. This is part of fluency. And it means, are your answers focused on the question, or do you start to get distracted from the question? You should always be focused on the question. And then the fifth one is those simple grammar mistakes. For example, do you forget about the past tense? If you do, try again. Try to always get the past tense when you need it. So just like the end of that movie Inception, we're coming out of one layer and back into the other and back into the other and back into the real world. Or maybe we're not. But that is our list. That is the 5 ways that you can study by yourself to get a really high score in your IELTS speaking test. And I'm very confident that if you follow those 5 steps and also the little lists inside of those 5 steps, you'll be able to get a really good score. You'll improve your score by at least 1 band because you'll be extremely well prepared. Remember, if you do want our help in preparing for the IELTS exam, that course, the IELTS Complete Guide, is here under the video. If this has been useful, make sure to like and subscribe. If you want help on specific questions in the IELTS speaking test, we have a playlist just over here, or maybe just over here. I'm Francis. Thank you very much for watching. Good luck in your IELTS exam. See you next time.